growing well. Such is the case with culture. When it pertains to culture, you have to make sure that you are constantly weeding something that may be trying to come up in your life. Constantly weeding. Listen, there is a marriage culture. Whether you recognize it or not, spouses, you and your wife or you and your husband have a culture with how you treat each other. And so the reality is, if you are not being intentional about what you say, what you don't say, how often you say it, how often you don't say it, if you're not intentional about that, I'm telling you, weeds will begin to grow in your marriage. And if you're, and this one thing about establishing a culture is another thing that even after you establish the culture, you have to make sure that you're always, whether it's through conversations, whether it's through a date night, whether it's through some quiet time, you're always making sure that you go back and you pull up the weeds that are trying to come and choke out your marriage. Always make sure that you're about the business of pulling up the weeds that may grow in your garden, because if you don't, you better believe that those roots will dig in and they will choke out any fruitfulness that wants to take place in your marriage. Same thing in your mind. If you are not constantly checking yourself and say, you know what, I'm not, in my mind we have a culture where we are not saying those things to ourselves. We will not have a defeatist attitude, and we're not going to be paralyzed by fear. So anytime a fearful thought comes up that is a negative type of fear, we're going to combat it with the word of God. That is what we do in this mind. That is how we move forward in this mind. And so now, even after you do that, you have to make sure that you are continuously capturing every thought and making it captive to be obedient to Christ. Because just because you establish a culture doesn't mean the weeds aren't still going to grow. How many of y'all know that you can plant seed, and just because you turn the soil and you plant the seed doesn't mean that those weeds are not going to find their way into your garden? And so you have to be constantly making sure that you are establishing a strong culture and looking for the weeds. Establishing a strong culture in your marriage and pulling up the weeds. Establishing a strong culture with your children and pulling up the weeds. Establishing a strong culture in your mind and pulling up the weeds. Somebody say, pull up the weeds. You have to make sure you pull up the weeds in your family, the weeds in your marriage, the weeds in your mind. Now, there is a product.